So in the last part of our lecture, we'll talk a bit about the limits of identity politics. Identity politics has come under increasing criticism lately. The most visible attacks come from the populist right or far right. Something that is very much making the headlines now are President Donald Trump's policies, most of which have directly targeted what is known in the US as DEI, i.e. diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are policies that are linked to identity politics and were designed precisely to revert historical injustices, whether on grounds of race, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. These have included the defunding of USAID programs, some of which were explicitly geared at improving the situation of the Roma. So it's not something that is contained within the US or that doesn't concern us as Roma. Such criticism from the right of the political spectrum often operates with fixed, essentialist notions of identity, reminiscent of 20th century racism, which need to be consistently opposed and deconstructed on the basis of solid historical evidence. However, there are more sophisticated critiques of identity politics which deserve to be taken seriously. The first of these is what I would call the liberal critique. The liberal critique argues that any form of identity politics is inherently dangerous because it reinforces fixed identities that are mutually exclusive. Can one be both Roma and Gaji at the same time? And that might trap individuals inside a group in which they might not want to belong. In this regard, the opportunity to exit, to leave a certain group, is indeed very important. And this issue has indeed come to the fore in the case of certain religious communities, where some individuals might find it very difficult to leave the group. Liberals further accuse identity politics of undermining the universalism of liberal democracy, where all citizens are equal, irrespective of gender, ethnicity, and class. In turn, critics of liberalism rightly point out that the alleged neutral citizen of liberalism is in fact the bearer of a specific identity, which is coded as white, male, bourgeois, heterosexual, and able-bodied. As a result, the universalist drive of liberalism cannot address or redress structural inequality and marginalization, and may in fact be complicit in it. Liberal demands for integration, which is an updated version of the earlier notion of assimilation, can be seen as demanding that the marginalized conform to the identities of their oppressors. To make this more specific to the Roma, calls for integration usually presuppose that the Roma would become French, Romanian, or Spanish, and so on, as the price for their integration. And this is an old debate going back to the French Revolution, when Jewish emancipation was being discussed in Parliament, and the notion was that a Jew could become a citizen, but at the cost of stop being Jewish in the process, or could remain part of a community that was, however, marginalized and did not enjoy full citizenship rights. Because the focus on identity is always related to historical injustices and the traumas these caused, focusing on identity continuously reproduces these traumas, forever unable to overcome them. At the same time, by doing so, it reinforces the same us versus them binary structure that is responsible for historical injustice, even if it does so from a subaltern perspective. In short, according to this critique, as long as we focus on identity, we will never be able to overcome the traumatic past. Now, this is something for us to reflect on, since a lot of the focus on Roma identity has been lately that on recovering the largely forgotten, obscured history of this group. Can we ask ourselves, could this be counterproductive? A second critique from the left argues that identity politics has veered in the direction of culturalist arguments, forgetting or glossing over the fact that identity is rooted in material conditions and very context-dependent, changing over both time and across space. By doing so, leftist critiques argue, it ends up reproducing the arguments of the oppressors, who also see identity in inflexible, essentialist cultural terms. Moreover, it precludes solidarities. My struggle for recognition as a Roma is different from that of a woman, or that of transgender people, or that of the working class for redistribution, and so on. Instead, leftist critics argue we should see these struggles as being connected and intersectional, and to understand the different forms of exclusion as related to the underlying logic of capitalism. And here I cannot emphasize it enough, as I also did in some of my work on the impact of COVID-19 on Roma communities in Eastern Europe, and in the masterclass on this topic I delivered for the Barvalipa Academy series, how important it is to understand Roma not only along ethnic lines, but also along lines of class. We need to understand that the economic marginalization and segregation of the Roma, an intergenerational phenomenon, is at least equally responsible for the current problems faced by Roma communities as racism. Or, alternatively, as I mentioned earlier, to understand that processes of racialization are very much grounded in material conditions, in economic class considerations. So to conclude, Paraphrasing Lenin, what is to be done? Is this the time for Roma nation building? And some would say yes, because it is the only way to establish a common Roma identity, to bring together a community otherwise divided along lines of citizenship, language, culture being always hybridized to some extent with that of the majority culture in any given setting, as well as the intersectional ones of class, gender, sexual orientation, disability that we discussed earlier. But wouldn't such nation building reproduce the instruments of our oppressors, as a result of which Roma were, and still are today, victimized in European societies? Could this nation building be undertaken differently, in an inclusive manner, without emphasizing the differences between Roma and non-Roma, and seeking instead allies outside the community and building solidarities with other marginalized groups, whether they are other ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ+ community, the poor, or persons with disabilities? But how could we do this without diluting that core element of Roma identity that we are interested in? Also, given the absence of a territory, which is unlikely to ever materialize, should this process be focused less on formal politics and more on what Judith Butler calls performativity, perhaps through the medium of Roma arts and culture, as ERIAC as an institution proposes? Rather than leaving you with answers, I would leave you with a question. What should the Roma politics of the future, in which you will hopefully be at the forefront, look like? Thank you.